Today we're going to talk about design titles. Have you ever wanted to know the difference between a UI designer and a UX designer? Or a graphic designer and a visual designer? Okay, so this is the second time I filmed this because the first one was garbage, so we're going to give this another shot. Raymond Stone here. In 2017 I wrote an article about design titles, and this video is going to be based on that article. So I'll link the article below for you to use as a reference. So what is an interaction designer? That's a question I used to get quite often. Throughout the web you see debate threads about the differences between all of the different design titles, and hopefully this video will clear up some of those differences. In this video I'll define designer, graphic designer, web designer, digital designer, visual designer, interaction designer, user interface designer, user experience designer, and product designer. With the exception of user interface designer and user experience designer, I'll avoid using any part of the titles within the definitions. Now, I'll begin by defining designer since all of the other titles are based on this one. A designer crafts solutions to problems. In my experience, if you tell people that you're a designer in its most generic form, people automatically assume you design clothing. And this comes as no surprise given the number of industries that use the term designer. Some of those industries include architecture, digital, fashion, film, and even furniture. But within the digital world, a designer usually dabbles in a bit of everything. This could include creating marketing collateral, building visual comps for responsive websites, or putting together presentations for internal use. Moving on to graphic designer. This is probably the most widely known subset of design to those outside of the design community. A graphic designer uses a combination of shapes, typography, color, and imagery to optimize the aesthetic communication of a brand or a message. A graphic designer may work in a variety of media. This could include signage, branding, marketing, digital, and much more. Within the digital world, which is what we're focused on, a graphic designer focuses on branding, online marketing collateral, social media graphics, designing UI elements, and again, creating presentations for internal use. Moving on to web designer. This term is mostly considered outdated by professionals outside of the freelance world, but the web designer title dominated the digital world before the rise of UI and UX. A web designer plans and then builds the front end of a website. Tasks may include information architecture, creating icons, building visual comps, sourcing content, front-end coding, using frameworks, utilizing content management systems, and even sometimes back-end coding. Up next we'll talk about the digital designer. This is one of the more generic titles. A digital designer creates elements for content that involves use of computer technology. Now, depending on the organization, a digital designer's responsibilities might resemble more of a product designer in one company or a visual designer in another company. And that brings us to the visual designer. A visual designer is basically a love child between the graphic designer and a user interface designer. A visual designer uses a combination of shapes, typography, color, and imagery to optimize the aesthetic communication of a product. The visual designer uses design principles to set tones and create moods for products and marketing collateral. On to interaction designer. Interaction designer is among the titles I need to explain the most. An interaction designer, abbreviated as IXD, creates the functionality of the elements in a user interface. The creation of this functionality involves building wireframes and/or mockups at various levels of fidelity. Those interaction designs are then either annotated or they're demonstrated using prototypes. Designers or front-end developers will build prototypes using a prototyping tool. This tool could be something like Marvel or InVision, or they could just code it from scratch. An interaction designer often builds information architecture such as sitemaps and user flows. This is to build a comprehensive map of where interactions could take a user, and which interactions must occur to take the user to a specific location within the app. People conflate interaction designer with UX designer. This could be due in part to the fact that most organizations have one but not both. A few large corporations like Google have both. User interface designer. A user interface designer, also known as a UI designer, creates the visual elements to enable the user to interact with an item of hardware or software. A UI designer uses design software such as Sketch, Adobe XD, Figma, Illustrator, and Photoshop to create UI elements and build visual comps. This involves the use of color, iconography, typography, and imagery to make the interface as attractive and as intuitive as possible. And like the visual designer, the UI designer uses design principles to set tones and create moods for products in order to most effectively deliver content and communicate interactions to the user. User experience designer. User experience designers are usually conflated with either UI designers or interaction designers. A user experience designer, aka UX designer, focuses on delivering the best possible emotions to targeted users. A UX designer seeks to understand a user's goals, along with the obstacles the user faces on the way to achieving those goals. And this process is necessary in order to deliver the most practical solutions. This involves user research, creating user personas, developing information architecture, building wireframes, prototyping, testing the prototypes, and monitoring early product releases. And that leads us right into product designer. Now, the term product designer likely evokes thoughts of what we today refer to as an industrial designer. So we'll do a slight tangent into this brief bonus title. An industrial designer drafts up CAD models of future physical products before those products are brought to life. This can involve drilling, hammering, welding, sewing, gluing, or cutting away at raw materials. Now, this is not a product designer, at least not in the digital world. In the digital world, product designer has almost entirely replaced what we used to call a UI UX designer. Now seemingly the most common design title within the digital sector of the tech industry, a product designer holistically creates deliverables throughout the life cycle of a product. This involves creating interactions and visuals, as well as occasionally contributing to the marketing of the product. A product designer possesses a general understanding and working knowledge of every other design title, usually without having any deep expertise in any one of them. Deliverables may include sitemaps, user flows, wireframes, visual mockups, prototypes, and more. Now, there are additional design titles within the tech industry. Some companies rename common design titles to conform to their cultures. For example, IBM has a position called software designer, which is basically just a product designer. And other companies will combine common titles that will result in uncommon titles. Product UX designer, UX interaction designer, and visual UI designer, to name a few. But practically speaking, these don't deviate far from the 9 titles we went over today. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, so be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.